Hello and welcome to R&R's Ask the Expert. I'm Kayla McGowan, editor-in-chief, and today we're discussing why contents insurance claims break down and how the claims ecosystem can prevent delays. My special guests today are David Gavilanes, regional business coach and training and development leader for Blue Kangaroo Packouts, and Dan Konno, owner of Blue Kangaroo Packouts of Bucks and Lehigh. Welcome, gentlemen.
Hi, Kayla.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Yes, thank you guys for coming on. I'm super excited to talk about this. It's no secret that the claims ecosystem is one that is the most talked about topic. That means us as the restorers, the adjusters or carriers, and then our consumers, right? And content is just making like a really big, I guess, breakthrough lately, I guess it would be. You guys have been in that world for a really long time, contents and pack out, but I think it's more of a conversation these days. So to start this kind of conversation off, where do contents insurance claims typically break down after a loss, and what factors make contents documentation more complex than structural assessments? And I know that this could be a multi-layer question. And Dan, I know you're on an interesting job right now, so maybe I'm going to toss
Yes.
this one up to you and then send it over to David. So, what are your thoughts on that?
So I guess, yeah, contents is a very unique beast. I mean, it's a very big part of the claim process. And I think the biggest challenge you run into is from a contents perspective, every single one is so different. The level of damage, contamination, the different types of homeowners you have, the relationship they have with their belongings. And I think where a lot of that breaks down is just from the start, you have to make sure that you're having the right conversations. The communication is key. Make sure you're setting the right expectations. Um, and I think one of the biggest challenges that I've seen changing lately is it used to be a lot more common that an adjuster would come out, meet you on site where you're both walking through, determining the scope of what's going on, coming up with a game plan so that you're both on the same page. And I feel like that's happening less and less, or that process is getting delayed and pushed out. So then you're kind of forced as the expert to go in and start making some of these decisions. So then where that breaks down is that whether there's a lack of communication, adjusters who are assigned to the claims get switched. So really from that point, it's just making sure that you're continuing to communicate and just over documenting everything. That makes sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. And I was going to say too, when it comes to like content side of things, it's more sentimental to the customer, right? Like when it comes to their home or business, like yes, it does matter, but you're not actually taking things that maybe have memories or, sentimental value, or it's an heirloom or whatever the case may be. The house may be a hand-me-down or an heirloom, but you're making changes to the structure. You're not necessarily making catastrophic changes or throwing out because you cannot salvage the items. And I think that's kind of, where maybe there's some misunderstanding when people try and get into the contents world because there's a huge emotional side of things. In addition to also the already emotional incident to their structure, right? So, David, do you have any additional thoughts on that? I know that you specialize in the training side of things for the team. So, where does contents documentation become more complex than the structural side of things?
It only gets about as complex as you want it to be, right? So you can get lucky and say you're not on very many claims during the year, and you've got one or two jobs in your warehouse, and you got eyes on it, and you can keep track of it that way. But once you start, taking contents restoration like more seriously, get more involved in it, do more claims, you've got to put yourself in a position to where you're documenting more using digital inventory and just creating a good chain of custody. So it gets complicated, but it's complicated in a structured and controlled way. So that's kind of it's really up to each company and every individual that's a part of the claim to decide, how complex do you want it to be. And the more complex it is, it's actually to your benefit as a restorer.
That's a great point too. And I would also say you mentioned chain of custody. I know we talked about this in a previous podcast where it's extremely important to have not only communication but chain of custody and it done properly because that's where I think things get a little jumboed, if you will. But to your point, you want to be as detailed as possible, especially when it's coming to people's personal belongings, right? It's not like you can just say, "Oh, I misplaced that 300-year-old china." Like we don't know where it is, right? Like that's not, it's not something that you can just easily say like, "Oh, we'll replace it," because you can't, right? The value and then the history and just what it means to the person, that you're working with. So with that being said, what are the most common causes of contents insurance claim delays? And I know that this is probably again depends on the loss, but Dan, you're in a situation where there's a fire, so I can only imagine what that looks like. You want to take a stab at this one? Maybe let's talk about a fire job and how that, breaks down.
Sure. I mean, from the start, some things that cause delays, like I said before, is sometimes, when a claims adjuster gets assigned to a claim, they want to set up a time to come out and see that. But I feel like there's becoming a lot less field adjusters, so their schedules are booked further out. So some of the challenges are like, the amount of time that goes by till that initial assessment takes place, can cause a few delays. And then again, in my mind, the biggest thing is the communication, right? So a lot of things can be delayed, whether there's a lack of communication, from our end as the contractor, there could be a lack of communication from the adjuster on the insurance side, but there can also be a lack of communication from the homeowner, right? So when we need to get some, ages, values, more information on certain items, the longer that process goes on, that could cause delays. Or, a lot of times we're non-salvaging, we're creating that inventory list. A lot of that stuff might still be on site until we can get approval to dispose of those items. So, there could be some delays where you want the homeowner to be able to go through that list, make sure there's nothing that they missed, again, because that's a very personal event. They just had a catastrophic fire in their house. I'm asking them, hey, is there anything sentimental in your house we should be looking out for? And of course there is, right? But to try to expect a homeowner to remember all of those items on the spot after a fire just burnt down, half of their home is kind of an unrealistic expectation. So, you know, sometimes going through that process, and then they might, go through the list, and then they might find 5 or 10 items that they go, oh, I forgot about this, I forgot about that, and then it's on us to do to the best of our abilities to then go back and find those items for the homeowner.
Yeah, and I would say too, especially to your point, when you ask a homeowner, like, do you have anything of sentimental value? The answer is yes, right? We automatically know it's yes, but they're going through so many different emotions and thoughts in that moment. Like, hey, where am I going to sleep? What are we going to do with our kids? When can we come back? Like, all of these questions are running through their minds. And then you throw hey, is there anything sentimental? And they're like, well, yeah. And then you say, well, what items should we look out for? And it's a blank, right? Or maybe
Right.
they list a couple of items. And so I think, again, this is a very emotionally charged situation. And so, I think we've all been there, right? We all document our own homes, right? This is part of the process. Like, okay, we have electronics and we have photos and like all these things, right? But the moment that somebody comes and asks you, like, hey, do you have this, or this? And you're like, that's no different for the homeowner than what we would experience in our regular day-to-day lives. So, David, do you have any additional thoughts? Because I think, every single person in this claims ecosystem can cause a delay, right? And it could be materials, it could be staff. Dan, you mentioned like there's not a lot of field adjusters. And so, what does their schedule look like? And then the homeowner, of course, I don't know. Do I have this? And then, 5 days into the project, they're like, oh, by the way, there's this pink baby blanket that if you can find it, I don't care if it's damaged, but we want to keep it. And then the team's like, wait, what? So, David, what are your thoughts on that type of stuff?
No, I think you nailed it. One of the biggest factors that can create a delay on a project, especially early on, are just people's feelings about the process. So if we have an established trust with the homeowner, there's sometimes an instinct to just want to make sure that we're checking all the boxes and that my adjuster's on board with what's going on. And I don't want to do something that might cause a situation where I'm not made whole on this claim. Now, if there's a case where it's a regional catastrophe and adjusters are overwhelmed with calls and they're not getting back to you for a few days, you can explain to the homeowner, it's like, hey, listen, I'm creating a contract between yourself and myself, and we can proceed with a PACAT and start to get your claim going. And eventually we'll touch base with your insurance adjuster and get on the same page. But somebody might not feel comfortable doing that, and so the delay can just be that uneasiness about the process and then waiting for the adjuster. And then several days goes by. And then by that point, perhaps they've started cleaning their own contents. And then the scope of work changes. And then the contractor's asking you what's going on. So a lot of times it's just if you can, find that trust early on, that can avoid a delay. But it does really come down to feelings a lot of times.
Yeah, and I would say too, you hit something that's very crucial in this whole process. The homeowner does not understand the whole process as a whole. They're getting different, conversations from the people that they're working with, and they are so uneasy. That's the other thing. It's not because they don't trust anybody. It's not because they don't want you to help them. It's because they don't know what is the natural process or the right process. And so they're kind of feeling like they're in a tug of war, if you will. And most of the times it's with themselves. It's not even with the adjuster or with the contractor. It's they really are trying to decide, what is the right thing for me to do. And, that can cause some severe delays because we know when it comes to emotion, it doesn't mean it's going to be an hour, it doesn't mean it's going to be a day. It could be days or even a week before they come to some type of conclusion. And that's on all fronts. It's not just on what we do day to day. And so, again, the emotional side of things, this is a very emotionally charged situation, whether it's water, fire, mold, any other, even bio, it's emotionally charged for them. And so we have to be at the mercy of the consumer. And it's not that it's a bad thing, but it can cause some severe delays in the entire process, which can cause other problems along the way, right? So, how do delayed or incomplete personal property inventories stall the approvals? And what are the key requirements to proper personal property claims documentation? I know you guys have a chain of custody and inventory, but what does that kind of look like? And more so for the people who don't really understand the process of packing out in contents, because I think it's extremely important to understand there are several layers to this. So, Dan, you want to take a stab at this one?
So this is actually perfect. So I think part of this is it's on us, and we always forget, right? Because we're doing this every day, several times a week, right? So I think it's also on us, and I have to explain this to my team all the time. Is guys, we really when we're speaking with the homeowner, we have to realize that they have no idea what we are talking about because they've never been through this, they've never done this before. They are not in the industry. So even as far as sometimes like discussing with a homeowner, we're using the terms like, hey, we're going to non-salvage this for you. We're going to do this. We're going to do that. But you have to remember, they don't know what that means. They don't. So there's some issues you get into where, you're using terms like that. You're going, hey, we're going to non-salvage. Make sure you get paid for this, right? But it's like, maybe in the beginning they weren't explained that once we do that, that item is being disposed of, right? So it's like if you miss that step, now all of a sudden, you're a couple days into a project, things are going along smoothly, and then once you get to that point where things need to start getting disposed of, now all of a sudden the homeowner's changing how they feel about certain things getting thrown away, or they were unclear about the process. And then, kind of like David discussed in his last answer, now all of a sudden the scope of work is changing. You may have to go back in your inventory, change statuses of items, start processing things differently. So I think a lot of it is you really have to explain it to the homeowner and start, from square one as if nobody knows, explain it in the simplest terms.
No, that's a great point too, because I think again, like our industry terms are not everyday use case in like our consumer world, right? in the industry, of course, we know what those things mean. And sometimes I feel like you have to repeat what you tell them every day, day in and day out, because, this is, again, something very foreign to them. And, maybe by non-salvageable, they think, oh, okay, well, it's in good condition, but they're just not going to go do anything with it. Interpretation is crazy during these types of events. And then when it comes to contents, it could be a scary thing for a consumer. So with that being said, David, do you have any additional thoughts on that? I know that it's again a multi-layer thing, but to Dan's point, we almost have to act like we've never had the conversation and just repeat, repeat, repeat to make sure that we are, one, giving the consumer peace of mind, but also making them feel human, right? It's not just another job. We're taking care of their personal property. So, I mean, any additional thoughts on that?
Yeah, just and no, Dan made an excellent point because you can like catch yourself just in like the nomenclature of the industry and no one knows what you're talking about. But my only advice would be, when you're looking to scope a loss for the first time with a customer, it might not be your first time. It'll be theirs. Just settle in. Just be prepared to spend as much time with them as needed.
No, that's a great point too. It may not be our first time. We may get in that autopilot mode because we're so used to it. But when it comes to contents, and in any job, honestly, we need to remember, to your point, this is their first time. Even if it's their second time, it's a different scenario. And so we just need to take our time to really make sure that they understand the process. Ask them if they understand the process, I think is another key thing. Do you have any questions? Do you understand what I said? Because I think we're all human. And sometimes when we're in that moment, we're like, oh, we don't have any questions. And then day five, I'm like, hey, where is that pink baby blanket? And it's like, oh shoot, we told you it was non-salvageable, and so it does make it a little rocky, but I think if we take the time to kind of explain things and go through everything with the homeowners, it makes a huge difference. And I think you guys already kind of answered my next question. But where do homeowners get most tripped up when with inventory requirements? And I think the reason why this is such an important question is one, it's terminology, but two, do they really understand that when it's disposed of, that's it? It's in the abyss. Is that part of where they get tripped up a little bit, David?
I think even us as restorers get tripped up sometimes because so I won't go into like the misconceptions that like everybody has about it. I'll just tell you how it should be basically. So if something is salvageable, but the homeowner doesn't want it, we've got to let them know we can clean it. So I'm going to list it as cleanable. And if you truly don't want it, we'll communicate that to your insurance company, and we we won't clean it. But and it'll be between you and them on how you're made whole on it. And typically, just what happens is they're paid the cost to clean on it. They can keep it, and they can be paid to like either clean it themselves or just dispose of it themselves. But we've got to be very clear with the insured and with the insurance company as to what is salvageable. Because if we start to non-salvage things that aren't, then it's like then that's not exactly a very uh, clean and dry process, so that's not good.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I would definitely say it creates like this gray area, right? And then gray areas they create questions and uncertainties, right? To your point.
Well, yeah. Well, the biggest uncertainty is if we declare something as non-salvageable, then the next step in the process is to get rid of it. But if, let's say, the insured is asking you to like, I don't want this. Can you just like non-salvage it? And like, yeah, but then they expect to keep it. Well, then that's a big point of confusion right there, and it's actually quite common.
Yes,
That's
a very, 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 very common. And then it also leads to another problem, right? Where that's a very slippery slope, right? Where you say, hey, I consider this, this is non-salvageable, but then they want to keep it, right? But also for the whole process to continue, the house needs to be cleared out. There needs to be nothing in there. So we can't just, all of a sudden you have people who are attached to certain items, they want them non-salvage, but they want it left here. Now all of a sudden we're not doing the job that we were originally hired to do, which was to get everything out of the house. so that the claim can continue. So
We
there's like
we can't let the
that gets challenging.
we can't let the tail wag the dog.
Right.
As you know, we're the ones speaking for authority. We have to be the ones that, lead them through the process, not the other way around. And if that ever does flip, then that's when you have conflict in the claim.
Well, I was going to say
Yeah.
the delays are astronomical at that point because it's almost like you're at a standoff, right? It stalls every aspect of that job. To your guys' point, you're removing all these contents from the home, whether it's being disposed of or cleaned and restored, right? That's where you guys come in. There's still structural work that has to be done. There's stabilization. There's all these things that have to be done. And if one chain in the link is, you know, tangled or broken, the whole ecosystem is messed up, right? The whole project is delayed. So, speaking of that, how do delayed content claims like extend the homeowner's displacement or slow down the claim, resolution? I think you guys did touch on this, but I think oftentimes we hear this quite a bit that a homeowner's insurance or even their funds only covers them to be out of the home for so long. And I think that is another thing. You're not just working against the time of the project, you're also working against the time of what is covered for them. And of course, we're not talking about coverage. We're talking about, how does that really affect the process? You can't have people in the way, I guess, is what I'm getting at, right? It makes it very complicated. So, Dan, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I guess a little bit of where this can delay the process is, every now and then you have these claims where the insured may not have, the appropriate personal property coverage. So this can cause delays where if you don't have a very good detailed non-salvage inventory list, the adjuster may not yet be able to disperse funds because they don't know how to allocate them appropriately yet, right? So if they only have 100,000 worth of coverage, and if we say our cleaning pack out and everything is going to be, I don't know, $70,000, but then they also have a $80,000 list of non-salvageables. If all that stuff's not figured out ahead of time, then that could delay how things get handled behind the scenes, and that could get pretty messy. But a lot of times we try to handle a lot of that on the front end by setting realistic expectations, understanding how much coverage they have, and then changing our scope based on that.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And I was going to say, just we're always working against the clock, but I feel like in the packouts and contents world, there's like several clocks that you're working against,
There's a
right? It's
lot of
not just
clocks.
one.
Right. There's everything has to get out so mitigation work can be done. There's, the lists have to be done so funds can start being paid. There's, the cleaning clock to get done so that they can get back in their house. Yeah, there's a lot of different steps where there can be potential delays. So it's just kind of keeping all of that coordinated and scheduled and on track.
Yeah, and I would definitely say too, for the people that really aren't in the contents and packouts world, some of this seems like probably foreign, and it should because it's a little different process. But it is a key process in all that we do every single day, right? Again, I mentioned it doesn't matter the type of loss, there is always going to be that component. So how does I know we talked about like chain of custody and inventory, but how does digital tracking reduce the disputes and repeated follow-ups and documentation errors? And David, I'm going to toss this one up to you because I know it comes a lot to training, and then Dan can weigh in. So David, what are your thoughts?
It's really the backbone of what we do. So if we can, create a proper inventory on the front end and 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 also create a very good total loss inventory. So what that does is it makes a clear distinction between what we're going to salvage and what we're not. And when we do that, we make an implicit statement that, all right, now you are now agreeing to the cleaning and restoration of all these items. So whereas a dispute without that occurs later in the process when, someone gets their stuff back and they've got a check in their hand that they have to hand over to you. And they might say, well, why did you clean this box full of stuff? I could have replaced all of this for, less than what you charge to clean it at the dollar store. That may be true, but it was on your inventory. It was approved to clean and it was not on your total loss list. So having that documented is just super important. It solves that issue. As far as tracking at your facility, that's just paramount. Otherwise, you're just constantly looking for things, constantly looking to replace things. So there's really this business cannot be handled properly without a proper inventory. I can think back to a time when I visited a contents company and it was a massive structure. Their warehouse was huge and nothing was inventoried and it was kind of all on shelves. And I thought two things. Either this is a major problem or the project manager or the warehouse manager has like some kind of phenomenal memory. Like where he's like a savant that just knows where everything is and where it should be. But the odds of that being the case are slim to none, so they probably just have a huge problem on their hands.
That's very interesting. And I know we come from the era of paper and pen. That's what we did for so long. But we know that we've come so far. And inventory is key to your point, like the scenario that you use. But it also gives accountability to the homeowner, not just the accountability to the restorer. I think that's another really big thing because unfortunately, we're all guilty of this. Do you read all 500 pages of your policy? Do you read all, when you're put in that spot? A lot of times it can be exhausting. And so sometimes they can overlook things or maybe they didn't even look at it, right? There's going to be those instances where they're not even going to look at it. And that's just reality. And so when it does come down to, hey, I could have cleaned that myself, or hey, I could have replaced that for way less. It's more of, hey, we did give you the documentation. We talked to you about this. Again, everybody has their own role in this process, and accountability is the same across the board. It's unfortunate, it does happen, but I think it's really important to rely on the documentation that we know is really what we get paid to do is to document, right? Dan, any thoughts on that?
And also, like another big value of the digital inventory is taking very good pictures. So, a couple things that, and I always go over with my team is when we're creating those inventory lists, I'm like, try to emphasize, hey, that first picture, I always want the first picture to be if you Googled that item, what would pop up on the screen? Because I want it to be easily identifiable, you know exactly what it is. A good point of that is, a few times in the beginning, somebody takes a picture of like a balled up North Face jacket, right? But like you by the picture in a dark, fiery house, you can't tell what that item is. So you just want very clear pictures, and then the next couple pictures should be, tags or serial numbers, things where if the homeowner has a dispute about the value of the item, right? Well, you have a barcode with a serial number. You can look up exactly what model that item is. There's no dispute on the value, right? But if you just take one picture and it says Sony flat screen TVs, right? Like, is that a $100 TV? Is that an $8,000 TV? So it's kind of just, kind of helping the homeowner through the back end of that process. Because again, I'm sure David can attest to this, but the thing we want to make sure that the homeowners understand is our job is to document all this and we can provide a good start, but we are not always in control of what the insurance company decides to pay them,
Yeah.
right? So we always want to make sure we're setting those expectations, but also putting the homeowner in a good position, right? Because the last thing we want is them to come back and think that we did not do a great job or that we should have got them more when that's part of the process that unfortunately like is out of our control.
No, I think that was really well said. And this brings me to my next question too. It's we do have homeowners that actually subscribe to our stuff. And so they're always listening and watching and learning. And so a question that I have for you gentlemen is what can a homeowner do before and immediately after a loss to help prevent documentation and inventory delays? And to your point, Dan, you kind of hit the nail on the head what you should be doing way prior. I'm not saying that it's going to happen in a perfect world, but this could mean so many things for you in an incident where you do have a disaster in your home. So, what are your thoughts on that, Dan? How can they, just be a little bit more proactive, and then what can they do
Yeah.
immediately after that loss?
So there's the far, crazy side of that end where I go, hey, as a professional, you should almost proactively be creating your own full inventory list of everything in your house, right? And it's like if there ever is that scenario where a massive event happens, right? You have an inventory list of everything that you have. If your whole house got burnt down and destroyed, right, you'd have to provide some sort of list or, of items that you had. And that's the extreme end, right? But there's other things you can do proactively, as simply as every now and then go through your house and take good detailed photos of the whole, the room so that you can visually remember what's in each room. You can remember the items that are in there. And then also just if you're buying higher value items is keep a digital file somewhere of receipts of expensive items that you have, and then also just make sure that you are every now and then make sure that you are properly insured. Make sure you have the correct amount of coverage. If you lost everything tomorrow, remember your coverage would have to cover the cost not only to replace everything, but to have experts like David or myself come in and do the work. So it's not just the value of the items, it has to be the value of the items plus some to make sure you're properly covered in case something like that would happen. And that also means, if you have jewelry, like auto parts or like expensive things like that, just make sure you have additional coverage on your insurance that would cover those items.
That's a really great point too. And I would definitely say like the tools and the parts that you have, jewelry, I know is a really big one, right? And it's just you can never over document even as a consumer. I think that's what it really comes down to. And to your point, if somebody's house burnt all the way to the ground, now you're like, okay, photographic memory, please don't fail me. What
Right.
can now I need to go room by room, and that's just you're going to miss something at the end of the day. And some of it's going to be of significant value, whether it's sentimental value or, monetary value. And I think that's really important. And we are consumers ourselves. So that's the other thing is like, okay, if what I would tell you to do is what I would do for my home, right? And I think that's what it really comes down to. David, any additional thoughts to what Dan said?
I know, I think Dan nailed it. And I can tell you from just recently renewing my policy that, most US homes have a mortgage behind it, right? So a bank truly owns it and we're making payments on it. And so that bank's going to require that you have enough insurance to rebuild the home should something happen. No one cares how much contents insurance you have. So therefore, you can be underinsured on contents. So if you're a homeowner listening, definitely look at it because even your agent, my agent asked me, "Are you sure you want this much contents coverage?" I was like, "Yes, I do. Thank you." So definitely make sure you've got enough.
No, that's a really great point too, because even just going through a policy, it's overwhelming, right? Like if you have to phone a friend, do it. But to your point, like, yes, you might be able to rebuild your home, but then there's nothing in it, right? At that point, like you have to start from scratch. You're not going to get an allowance that allows you to replace everything in your home. And then again, the sentimental value, that's never going to be replaced by anything monetary, but at least at the end of the day, you have something that can maybe be like replicated or something that you're allowed to do it. But again, if you didn't have the contents coverage, you kind of SOL, right?
And the
Yeah,
cost is
that
accurate.
brought a good point. Oh, sorry. I was saying that brought up a good point. So, because I just recently ran into this experience, right? So, if you have old documents, family, like, so an example was we just did a house that had old family recipes, right? So, a good thing is like if you're somebody who keeps old family recipes, news articles, newspaper clippings, photo albums is I highly recommend getting a digitized version of all of those items. Same thing, like if you have a bad fire in your house, those are things that cannot be replaced. So, a good thing would be to proactively get digital copies of things like that.
You just literally sparked a light bulb in my head. So above our stove, I have recipes from my mom and my grandma who's passed away, and I think I would be a complete train wreck. So
Right.
on my list to do is now digitize all of my recipes. So thank you, Dan, for that nice
Yes.
reminder. David, what were you gonna say?
You know what? That the thought. I just started listening to Dan, and I'm good.
Okay. Hey,
Sorry. Sorry
that
about that. I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, you're
That,
fine.
I mean, that's part of these conversations, right? There's a lot of brain power here, and there's a lot of thoughts, and there's a lot of things that we would love to share with consumers and even the industry. And it's just one of those things. I'm sure when we talk again, we're gonna have one of these moments, and it just happens when there's multiple people on the call because we're obviously very passionate about what we're talking about. And so the excitement and there's a thought in my brain, those are the types of things that just show how real and raw we are. So I have two more burning questions, and the first one I'm going to send over to David. How does early and organized inventory management help speed up the process? And I think Dan kind of touched on this in the beginning. It's all in the front end of things. Um, but what does that look like? Even for a consumer listening, obviously there's conversation that needs to be had ever before trying to do any type of inventory, right?
Yeah, we're looking for approvals to claim. So the approval to pack out, that's pretty easy to obtain because if the structure needs to be, restored a little bit or completely restored, we need to get the stuff out of the way. So that's pretty easy to get approved on. But from there, we're going to create an inventory of what we've taken. And are these things that are restorable? And do we want to try to restore them? If that's the case, then we need to provide a list. Now, if our list is a good list, and it's thorough, then that's something to work with, and then we can look at it and then come to an agreement on what everything is, and the homeowner can look through it, and he or she can say, perhaps these are things we don't want to take back, and they'll work that through with their insurance company to be made whole on those items. But if we don't provide a list that's very useful, then it's like, what are you want us to pay this much for what again? Like, what are we paying for? And so, and then the insured might ask, well, I have more than this. What is, you're just showing me, 30 boxes of bric-a-brac. Like, what all is in there?
Yeah.
So that's definitely something that can like either, slow things down or create confusion if we don't handle that as we should.
No, those are some really great points too. And I think one thing that I really cannot stress, and I think you guys have stressed this really well, is the communication portion of it. Like you can have the best inventory, you can have the best, chain of custody, you can have the best like people that, pack out the contents like beautifully, it's labeled, it's all, padded and taken care of. But the communication is where a lot of stuff breaks down. And so that means that it can slow the approvals down. To your point, a consumer can say, like, I have way more than this. Like, I don't even know what these 30 boxes are. Where are the other 30 boxes, right? Like that is so real. That can totally happen. So I think, for those of you listening, if you want to go back and listen back to what David just said, it might save you a headache or two. Dan, what can adjusters and restoration contractors do to streamline the process as a whole? And I think, again, it comes to process and procedure, but how can we work together, I guess, is the biggest thing. Because at the end of the day, even though the contractor has their job, the adjuster has their job, at the end of the day, the main goal is to take care of the consumer. So what do you think that looks like?
Honestly, I think the biggest thing is just building that trust and reputation, right? And I think, David provides us with outstanding training. So I think the more and more we're working with adjusters, the more and more we're working on these claims, when we explain to them our high level, our detail of documentation and how we go through the process, it drastically creates trust and it speeds things up. A good example of that is, I've had an adjuster talk to a homeowner and said, hey, create an inventory list, but don't throw anything out. Like, we need to review this. And then, I get on the phone, I talk to the adjuster and I say, hey, I just sent you the matter report of the loss. We can both agree that this was a pretty bad fire. Here's the process. This is what we're going to do. If I'm documenting everything and I have approval from the homeowner, as long as I'm documenting it, do I have the right to dispose of everything? And a lot of times, because they know of our process, we're not just writing it down on a piece of paper, we're providing proper documentation. So they'll allow us to inventory, dispose of things right away, which drastically reduces the amount of time the whole process takes. So I think it's just, again, it's just building that reputation awareness for our process and how we do it.
Yeah, and I would say too to even make sure that we're communicating that with the adjuster too, right? And answer their questions if they have any questions. Because at the end of the day, if they have questions, the homeowner, the consumer, the end user is the one that is going to feel it the most. And the same thing for us. If we have questions for the adjuster and we're not getting the answers or we don't ask them, then again there's additional delays too, and that can just make the consumer's experience the worst possible experience that they could have ever had. So we covered a ton today, excuse me. We covered a ton today, and I'm looking forward to future conversations as well, but I just want to thank you gentlemen both so much for your time and all that you do for the industry. Before we sign off, do you guys have any closing thoughts?
No, I mean, I think we went over a lot.
Awesome, David.
Just make a good inventory.
Yeah, if you take anything away from this podcast, take away that you need to have a great inventory and use the proper tools, right? Not paper and pen. Let's lean on our digital aspect side of things, and take photos, as Dan mentioned. Well, that's all for today's episode. Thank you all so much for tuning in, and we will see you on the next episode of Ask the Expert. Take care.